Hello, everyone, and welcome back to episode 15 of Politics. I'm here with Alex,
Hello, everybody.
Ryan,
Hi, everyone.
and myself. We have returned from a brief hiatus to discuss what's going on in the world today. So today's going to be quite an interesting and most likely controversial episode, but we'll do our best to present it in a honest and bias-free light. So without further ado,
Okay, so I'm going to start by explaining a little bit of the background behind the killing of George Floyd, which has sparked nationwide and I guess worldwide protests. So on May 25th, 2020, George Floyd, who is a 46-year-old black man, was killed in Minneapolis, Minnesota during an arrest for allegedly using a counterfeit bill. Derek Chauvin, a white police officer, knelt on Floyd's neck for almost 9 minutes while he was handcuffed and lying face down in the street, begging for his life and repeatedly saying, "I can't breathe." A second and third officer further restrained Floyd while fourth prevented bystanders from intervening. During the final 3 minutes, Floyd was motionless and had no pulse, while Chauvin ignored onlookers' pleas to remove his knee, which he did not do until medics told him to do so. All four officers were fired the following day after videos made by witnesses and security cameras became public. 2 autopsies found Floyd's death to be a homicide. Chauvin was initially charged with third-degree murder and second-degree manslaughter, to which was later added second-degree murder. The 3 other officers were charged with aiding and abetting second-degree murder. Floyd's death triggered demonstrations and protests in more than 75 U.S. cities and around the world against police brutality, police racism, and lack of police accountability. So I guess, what does everybody think about these events over the past few weeks?
yeah, it's definitely been a weird couple of months, especially the last couple of days of, with coronavirus and all that. The world's been a strange place. Now you have entire U.S. cities that are already locked down, or even further locked down. I'm watching the news and I see protesters being tear gassed and shot with rubber bullets for otherwise peacefully protest until a few hours later so they turn into riots where you have like the Target in Minneapolis, Minnesota was looted. The Minneapolis Police Department's 3rd precinct was burned to the ground with videos showing live ammunition being cooked off as their armory was burned. So besides all the craziness, this is not a wake-up call. I keep saying like, oh, George Floyd's death, a wake-up call. No. The issues that these protests have sparked have been around in our country since 1619, when the first African slaves were brought here. It's just taken us so long to finally realize it. We just kept hitting snooze and hitting snooze until now people are fed up. They can't stand it anymore.
Yeah, and you had the civil rights movement in the 1960s and 1950s, and that got us somewhere, but people thought that was the end. That was nowhere near the end because it's such a massive issue that has continued rolling on. Of course, it became better, but the racial injustices in America are much deeper than just like a police brutality or like a racial profiling, anything like that. It stems from entirely like the socioeconomic standing of minorities in the United States that is caused by the history of those minorities there. And now this culmination of, firstly, these hundreds of years of this oppression of minorities, combined with people losing their jobs, having insane unemployment numbers, having people being fed up with the coronavirus lockdown, all that comes together to cause, well, firstly, peaceful protest, and most protests that are happening around the United States are happening peacefully, but then there are also riots for people who feel like taking the opportunity to act when they feel like it. So we have this like pent up energy and this push finally from not only from African Americans but also from white people to push forward to gain more equality on all bases in America.
Right, because on paper we're equal, right? Everybody has the right to vote when you turn 18. The Voting Rights Act, you have the Civil Rights Movement Act from the 60s, 64. we're supposed to have equal pay between men and women as well, like was signed by President Kennedy in '63. But paper is not enough. Clearly, you have movements that have discriminated against African Americans since the '60s and '70s, with under the Nixon administration, under the law and order style of law, where we disproportionately go after African Americans and Latin Americans to fill our private prisons, to enforce crack cocaine with a higher drug charge than powder cocaine, things like that. So like the systematic racism has been there forever. It's just it each finds its a new way to rear its ugly head. When slavery was banned, the legal way of oppressing African Americans was slavery in the 1860s. Then when that was banned, they moved to sharecropping, or they moved to Jim Crow, or they moved to sundown towns. It's like it's always been there. It's just it finds its own way to rear its ugly head. And right now, it's been the last 20, 30 years. It's been police brutality with the Rodney King riots in L.A. in the 90s. You had the Ferguson, Missouri riots after Trayvon Martin was killed in 2015-14, I believe. You had right now with George Floyd causing these massive protests. And as Alex was saying, right now it's so much work. The protests are so catching on because no one else has anything to do. Everything's been closed. So then with the protest we saw several weeks ago with the coronavirus protesters, with the armed people protesting in front of the Michigan State Capitol, people were like, well, if they can do it, so can we. Except those protesters weren't shot at with tear gas despite the fact they were carrying AR-15s. But I digress. So it's the saying that this is new is false. It's just finding its new way to rear its head. And so that's why I think that people are so enraged, is because we keep seeing videos of people getting killed. We saw the guy in Georgia in February get run down by two people in his neighborhood for jogging, and he was murdered. You now have George Floyd getting murdered for supposedly passing off a counterfeit $20 bill, which, as far as I remember, the United States still has right to due process and just process of the law, and you don't get to just kill somebody for, even if they are guilty of a crime. It's not how it works here. We don't do judge, jury, and executioner by police on the street. You go to court. You have lawyers. That's the Constitution. It's right there in the Bill of Rights. We don't do this kind of this guy was mean to me, so I'm gonna kill him. No, it's not how it works. And so the fact that we just totally disregarded the rule of law and have made so many exceptions for the officers that are supposed to uphold the law is just completely appalling. And that's why I think that people are so upset about it, and that's why they need real change.
Yeah, and leading on from that, it's this kind of idea of like police brutality. It's a thing. It's a thing in the United States. It's really an issue because the police are empowered to a point where they're not responsible for their actions. All the shootings in the United States that happened by police officers, 99% of them got off scot-free. Or if they did go to trial, they were acquitted. Only 1% of officers went to jail for shooting. And if you compare that to countries around the world, of course, America is different because of the Second Amendment. There are guns. That's why police have guns. It's in the interest of safety for them to have guns. It's fair from both sides. But because people have guns and because of other issues such as like militarization of police, you have weapons given to policemen that they feel the need to use. If you have something that just lies there, what's the point of having it if you're not going to use it? That's a kind of logic that permeates throughout police departments. Let's fill out our budgets. Let's have these budgets. Let's use it for policing. Let's buy new toys. Let's get new things. Get more and more and more so we can police better. But it's been proven that you need trust in the police in the policing, and that's why you have such a distrust with policing, and that's why policing is so much poorer in the United States than, for example, in Europe. Of course, it's different countries, but at the same time, it's still. You could reach the same conclusion.
To become a police officer in the United States, you need a high school diploma or GED, and you need 21 weeks of training. In countries like Finland and Sweden, you need degrees. You have to go to college to become a police officer. You have to have 7 years of training. You have, with 4 years of degree and 3 years of training. You need more training to become a barber or a esthetician in the United States, and you become a police officer. That
Yeah.
is a massive red flag. You have people who are being entrusted with the law. They're being entrusted to pull people over on their own discretion. They have to have some sort of. I mean, you don't just pull somebody over without guessing, usually. So you have to have some sort of thought process behind that. You have to be able to make really quick decisions with people who are scared because of everyone else they see on the news. And you expect them to make these decisions being 18, 20 years old, or however old they are, with only 20 weeks of training. Clearly it's a broken system, as we're seeing. And people are over it, and they want change.
So, what do you guys think about like the calls to defund the police?
Well, the thing is, by defunding the police, they don't mean stop policing as a whole.
Right.
What's happening in Minneapolis and what the city's voted for is to break down the police, and this happened in I can't exactly remember, but in a town in New Jersey.
Camden, New Jersey.
Camden, New Jersey. That's it. So they defunded the police. That means you break down the police structures that are currently there, and you reset it. You create new standards. You create new laws, and because you have police officers that have been there, got tenure, but haven't gone through the required training that is required under the new program. It would be all reset. Everyone has to be retrained, and it's a reset of the system. And that's why in Camden Camden used to be the one of the murder capitals in the United States. There were fifth most murders in the United States in Camden, but after that they dropped down significantly. Crime dropped down because there was more trust in the police, and this kind of trust issue stems from it not being controlled. You don't have a national system of training police officers. You don't have a national register of how and why and what police are meant to be doing in different states. And so the calls for defunding the police, they're twofold. Firstly is defund, restructure, and restart the police force. And secondly is to stop the police doing things that could be done by social workers, by medics. Police are called to so many things that they're just not trained to deal with. Like for a suicide call, you call the police. Why isn't that a trained social worker or a medical worker who's able to lead and help that person? Stuff like that. And they should have the responsibilities of enforcing the law, but not other responsibilities that shouldn't be under them.
Going off the defund the police note, a city that neighbors mine has a population of 12,000 people. Okay, every year Mardi Gras, because I'm from Louisiana, we have Mardi Gras here. In the parade, they drive their riot vehicle, which is a armored personnel carrier. It's a military style thing for a town of 12,000 people. Okay, that city does not need a riot capable. We haven't had a protest in my area in years. And the last one I think was a protest against ending segregation. So do with that what you will. So the fact that you have small towns that are basically given blank checks by state and federal government authorities, basically saying you have money, use it somehow, doesn't make the streets safer. That riot vehicle has never once made me feel more secure or ended some sort of crime ring in my town. It's just the police say, well, we have money, might as well spend it. And instead of that money being spent for retraining, racial bias screenings, sensitivity training, it's being spent on weapons that were designed for war. We didn't, Stryker didn't, the vehicle's a Stryker, but the Stryker wasn't designed for riot control. It was designed to escort soldiers into battle. So when you say that, the police need this to protect us from what? We saw armed protesters, literally armed with AR-15s, and there's a picture of a guy in a subway with an AT-4 over his shoulders. I don't know how he got that. It's a rocket launcher, by the way. I don't know how that happened, but that happened. In Michigan, and there were no issues. The cops sat there and watched them. The protesters were spitting in their faces, ignoring the quarantine, ignoring the social distancing rules. No problems. All right? But now these protesters are challenging the narrative of that police should be the end all be all. But Alex, I agree with you. The scope of the police has drastically expanded in the last 100 years. They've been called for more things that they should not be trained for, and it's partially society's fault putting in that position. But I think majority of the blame has to go on the system that was created. The fact that now we're challenging that narrative and saying like, no, you should be trained better, you should have harder requirements. Then the police starts cracking down on people and getting rid of that so-called free speech thing. I think it's just really convenient that when rallies disagree with you, obviously we shut it down, and that's the exact opposite of what America was designed to do. The First Amendment protects freedom of speech, and it protects you from the government action.
Yeah.
So it's just
Yeah, picking up on
it's
the
just
point
really
that you
upsetting
made.
to see the fact that the government is acting the way they do and they're getting away with it.
Yeah, picking up on the point that you made, like the militarization of police, like I was saying, like stocking up on like these toys that we're going to be using. Like by law, the police can the police is allowed to have weapon carrying planes and helicopters, police force of army planes and helicopters. What do they need that for? That isn't. It's entirely gone too far, and there isn't.
Also, we forgot to
federal
mention the fact
control
that
over it.
the National Guard was called in too.
Yeah.
In places like D.C. and Minnesota, where the National Guard was never called in when the protesters were actually armed, but when the
Yes.
protesters, I mean, obviously the looting is an issue. That's understood. You know, that's separate from the protest. That's off message. That's an offshoot of the main movement. The Black Lives Matter movement is not the looting. That just get that notion out of your head. So the traditional Black Lives Matter people that are just, you know, in the streets, they're masked up, by the way. They're actually respecting a lot of the coronavirus issues. They're masked up.
But they're not social distancing.
They are, yeah. They have signs. I mean, they're not like yelling, they're not cursing at the police. They're not like, the majority of them aren't. The majority of them are not throwing bricks and all that. That's the fringe the media is highlighting, you know, because it's also against their narrative. So the fact that the National Guard gets called in and they call in the SWAT teams with the riot shields and the full gear against protesters that are just kind of standing there, and they don't do that for the armed people is just insane. It just really shows that how the racial divide in America is true. Our country is insanely racist. Of course, we're all equal on paper, but that proves nothing. People get away with literally that George Floyd was murdered on the street by people who were supposed to protect him. So the fact that now that finally the federal government's woken up a little bit and is calling for change, that's good, and I think we'll move on to that now.
Yeah.
Let's talk about
If we have time, there's like a couple things that I just wanted to mention. So like 4 things actually. So like first, it's actually safer to be protesting like with the National Guard as the people you're like with rather than the police, because the National Guard actually has like laws and regulations that they have to uphold more so than police do, which is an interesting thing that I think like at what point, why should the national military like who has the same, or like the police who has the same capabilities as the National Guard not have to follow the same regulations? Also, Alex, to your point about like having like the weapons as toys, I think it's also like necessary to realize that like when police are provided like with these things, like with the tanks or whatever, all of the things that they don't really need to do their job, it's like subconscious to the fact that we have them, so therefore we will need them for our work. They wouldn't give them to us unless we need them, which is another problem like with the system. Like we shouldn't be giving them these things because it creates like this subconscious thing where if you're in a like a moment of danger, you're like, okay, well I need to use this thing that was given to me in case this happens. Also, I think it's interesting, I didn't really think about this, but like this is kind of the first protest in a really long time that you're actually, I mean, this is like against police brutality. Like protesters are actually facing like the people, like the police that they're protesting against, like on the streets. Like when was the last time like protesting against the Vietnam War, not even like you're not out there seeing like the people who created like the war policies. Like I think that's one reason why there's so much violence boiling over, is because like this is literally 2 sides of a conflict. I mean, not saying that all police are like bad, because they're not, but like I think that's one reason why this is becoming such like an aggressive situation, because it's literally like two people who are, or two sides who are on opposite sides of a protest and are in the streets together. And then finally, I think this is something that's kind of interesting. I've seen, I forget which city specifically, but I've seen like at least a couple cities who are now saying like their police departments, like the police now have to step up and like say something if their superiors are like using excessive use of force. And it's like, why did we have to wait until someone was killed, or like so many people were killed before that's a thing? Like, why hasn't that been a thing already? And I think it's just sort of like comes back to the entire point where this is like a breaking point. Like these rules and laws and stuff don't come into play unless we are speaking out against them. I think that's why it's so important to like for these protests to be happening.
Yeah, and like you said, like the protesters are protesting against the police, and as a policeman, you're there because, well, your job is to be righteous. You have the law behind you, and you're enforcing that law, and you think you're right. Every policeman think they're doing their job right, and they think they're enforcing the law, and they have the government behind them. When you have your job, your livelihood being attacked, saying that you're doing it wrong, and you don't know what you're doing, and you're horrible at your job, of course that causes a divide, and that's why you need reform from the top, not from the protests help reform from the top, because if you have that enforcement agency that says no, we're right all the time, they can't take criticism. If you can't take criticism, then you need that to change, especially in a democratic country like the United States. So, moving on to the reforms. So, the Democrats put forward a bill that covers a lot of things. Everything from banning chokeholds to banning no-knock warrants. It also includes a lot of oversight over all police, a lot of data collection. There is no federal data collection on police shootings or police brutality or police misconduct whatsoever. That is done specifically by municipality by municipality, by police department. It is entirely chaotic. We have no national numbers, and yes, there are some people that are putting together, and all the numbers that you see, they're not accurate. Like every number that you see in the news cannot be accurate because there is no collected data. There is nobody that's collecting it entirely. So we don't actually know how bad the issue is. Yes, we have an estimate, but again, so that's what the Democrats are going for. They also are banning what we were talking about, the militarization of police, the transfer of equipment from the military to the police. So it also enforces mandatory body cams for all police officers, and mandatory in-car cams that have to be on at all times when they're interacting with civilians. And finally, as the last part of the bill, is to actually name lynching a federal crime. Until now, and still because the bill hasn't passed, lynching is not a federal crime. 4,700 Americans, most of which who were African Americans, have been lynched since 1890, and 200 bills in Congress to make lynching federal crime have all failed. Of course, there are.
And just recently, Senator Rand Paul blocked it. He was the one who was the deciding vote, saying that it was, quote, too broad, it could apply to anything. The fact that we can't even agree to ban something that the United States has acknowledged has been a problem since the Grant administration in the 1870s just again proves how backwards we are and how so far away we are from actual equality. Like, a lot of the talking points is well, on paper this, on paper that. It's enforcement, people. We're not there. And the fact that we can't even agree on that is just insane. But, at least better late than never, I suppose. But the federal government's trying. And we've got to see if everybody else will jump on board.
Yeah, but of course it's the Democrats that put forward a bill, so that bill's going to pass the House, and it's going to just die in the Senate, just like every other anti-lynching bill, the other 200 that have failed in the Senate.
Especially with the president being so against the movement. He's been claiming that Antifa's behind this, which Antifa's a far left
movement.
I mean, they're pretty radical. They incite a lot of violence. But the Black Lives Matter movement has not been necessarily associated with them. They've been, like I said, the Antifa people are the ones burning things and The center movement is not part of that. So when the president labels everyone as, oh, they're all anarchists, whatever, it just totally throws the whole idea off message. Especially when he says things like, there's also a movement now to get rid of the Confederate statues in the Capitol and rename several U.S. military installations that are named after Confederate generals and presidents and leaders. And the president recently just said that we will never do that under any circumstance, rename our military installations. And now the Republican mantra is that it's up to the states to move statues, because every U.S. state can send 2 statues. Basically, you pick 2 people to be immortalized in the halls of Congress, and it's up to the state legislator to repeal and change who's the person. So the federal government wants to say everyone has to change. You can't get rid of Confederates, but now the Republicans are saying that it's up to the states. So with the fact that the two sides are so far apart on the issue, despite the fact that the majority of the American people are like, hey, this is a problem, we should fix this. It's...
I mean, I think it's in times like this, like, where we need really strong national leadership. I'm not trying to really necessarily compare what's going on right now to slavery, even though that comparison can be made, but, like, think about if Abraham Lincoln led it up to each of the states to ban slavery. I mean, like, that's how it was. And nothing would have changed unless, like, the federal government stepped in and did something about it. Like, we need strong leadership, or else it'll keep going how it is now, because right now it is just state leadership, and it has been, and that's why we still have problems.
Yeah, and stemming from the Civil War and the Confederacy, you have that continuation of this idea of the Confederacy. Even the Union won, and the Confederacy was meant to be treasonous and they were supposed to destroy it entirely. That was kind of the idea. That's kind of what the Union was going for in the Civil War. And of course, there are a lot of other issues really in the Civil War that caused it, and I don't want to be going into that. But that idea of that slavery and Confederacy has stayed, especially in the South. And you had a return of that under Nixon with the Southern Strategy, where it was kind of an appreciation and acknowledgement of the Confederacy and this idea, and that's kind of what has been building up through Reagan and through other Republican administrations into what we have now, into Donald Trump. And so this kind of idea, this continuous saying racism is okay, but like underground, from the Republicans has been like further dividing it. But that's the whole idea. That's the whole thing. Democrats are pulling one way and Republicans are pulling the other way, and that's why we can't agree on anything. Nothing can get passed. Well, I'm exaggerating, being a bit cynical there, but that's.
I mean, it stems from the fact that like the Confederate flag recently was banned from NASCAR events, and people saying like, well, the Confederate flag's not racist; it's just history. I'm like,
it's our heritage. It was 4.5 years. What kind of heritage is that?
Yeah,
right.
Slavery was also heritage.
Right, and like the fact that like, oh, the Civil War is about states' rights. Yeah, states' rights to own slaves.
You don't
like,
want that as your heritage.
Right.
Yeah.
So like the fact that we can't even agree on basic tenets of like, hey, maybe we shouldn't immortalize people like Jefferson Davis, who owned slaves. Like, there's the main thoroughfare, one of the main roads in New Orleans, is named Jefferson Davis Parkway, I think, and then Robert E. Lee Drive.
Yeah, I mean, like, I'm all for free speech and everything, but at what point, like, why would you want that? Like, why would you want to memorialize that?
And at some point, it ventures onto the hate speech trail, which is not protected by the First Amendment. Hate speech has repeatedly been knocked down. So, like, when you're like flagrantly offending somebody and offending a large group of people, it's not okay anymore. It's not like, oh, it's your free speech. No. When people feel threatened by the very sight of that, saying like, well, this person probably won't even get charged because of the way our law system works, all that goes out the window. And until you can reform that basic tenet of that the equal protection under the law, under the 14th Amendment, actually provides equal protection under the law for everyone, no matter their creed, race, skin color, gender, orientation, whatever. Until that happens, this stuff's going to keep happening. Yeah. People are going to keep getting killed, and people are going to keep getting upset about it, because they rightly should, because we just watched someone get murdered on CNN. Like if that happens
Yeah.
in other countries, the United States would be the first one to say, "You can't do that. You have to reform. We're calling out in the UN." But when we do it, it's okay because our politics are different.
Well, here's the thing. I'm glad that other countries are like stepping in and doing something. Like, I mean, I forget which countries exactly. I think like Great Britain, but like they're banning or like they're ending exports of like tear gas and rubber bullets and things like that to the United States, as they should. Like, I'm glad we're being called out. Like, our national government isn't doing enough. Saying it's states' responsibility is just a way to push blame and make sure that nothing actually changes.
Yeah, and talking about the international sphere, there's so many countries around the world where you had, again, protests for firstly in in connection with George Floyd and in solidarity for the protests that are happening in America, but then also bringing up racial issues of their own. You have the massive racial issues that are currently of issue in the UK. They also have a horrific racial issue. You have the horrific racial issues with the Aborigines in Australia, and they're having also protests. And you have the same thing in France, where that racism is profound, and you have so many people just showing solidarity towards that. It's happening all around the world, and this solidarity is continuing. But I feel like the protests around the world are more tackling the issue more at hand. The systemic racism, firstly around the world, depending on which country, and that depends on which minority is being is being oppressed. But for example, in the United States, the systemic racism stems from the very beginning historically, because of everything that's gone on, everything that we talked about, and it continues on. And the expectation is that the African Americans in America are supposed to just get to the same level as white people from a socioeconomic point of view, because, well, it's written by the law. That just hasn't happened.
Well, and it can't happen with
Exactly.
the way that the way the law is written. When like the Nixon administration, the Reagan administration, criminalized saying crack cocaine is somehow worse than powder cocaine, because powder cocaine's mostly used by white Americans and crack cocaine is mostly used by minorities. When those were criminalized, completely different. You can't ever be equal because you're intentionally trying to keep somebody else down.
Just the,
So when
can I like the
yeah, go
I'm
ahead.
not sure if people know exactly what you're referring to, but like the mandatory minimum sentencing laws for both like crack and powder cocaine are like completely different. Like I'm pretty sure I don't know if this is completely true, but I think one is at least like 10 times more than the other. So it's like very, very discriminatory. And also like once people go to jail for this, there's been like scientific studies that show that when people are discriminated against in the criminal justice system, like it leads to recidivism after you get out of the jail system and things like that, and it just creates like a spiral of crime and things. So
Right, and the main way that the world changed, the main reason why, not the main reason, but one of the reasons why like slavery ended when it did, was because of international pressure. Like Alex was talking about the protests around Europe and things. That's how, when the British and French refused to support the Confederacy, that's one of the reasons why the federal government won. So when international pressure flips against the United States, like I was saying earlier, and says, "Hey, you can't do this," that's what drives change. When that's how we have to do this. We're not going to do this because of the kindness of people's hearts. We've shown, it's been demonstrated time and time again that politicians are not willing to erase, try to erase the stain. They're okay with it. They're complicit in it. They're saying, well, it's heritage. No, it's not good heritage. I don't know of any people who are actively like supporting this or supporting racism and that stuff, but they're just doing it subliminally and doing it through the law. And until that changes, we'll never have equality socioeconomically, schooling, education level. Like none of that happens until you fix the letter of the law to allow people the opportunity that America is supposed to give them.
yeah, I mean like that. Like America is supposed to be the leader in equality and standing for what's right, and we're failing so hard right now.
Yeah, and we bring up a lot when we talk about negatively about politicians. We mostly reference Republicans, but it's not only them. It's also the Democrats. It's the like both parties that are entirely culpable for it. Under Obama, the first African American president, things got better for African Americans. But again, it's only been 3 years after that. Trump hasn't dismantled some insane system. It's not his fault, and it's not Obama's fault. It's entirely like everyone has not done enough to lower the racial inequality and just general inequality between races in America.
Right, going on with what Alex was saying just a second, the talk about private prisons, about how we want to abolish private prisons. Those were Bill Clinton was the one who signed the bill into law and was the main driving force behind private prisons. So like Alex said, it's not just Republicans, it's Democrats too, and it's the fact that a lot of the Democrats that have changed their minds now were the ones that were pro these programs and systems back then. There's a video of Bill Clinton making a speech supporting his wife's campaign in 2016, where they were like, they started protesting in the middle of a speech, saying like, you were part of the problem. You're some of the reason why this stuff is happening. So the politicians now are not, blue, red. They're all guilty of it. It's just who's gonna reform first. I mean, it's also a huge issue, the fact that this death is the one that forced the federal government's hand. Why wouldn't we act when Trayvon Martin was killed? Why didn't we act when Breonna Taylor was killed? Why didn't we act then? So it's kind of upsetting that politicians like Nancy Pelosi have only come around now because of public pressure being so intense. But the fact that we should have been making policy about this decades ago. We should have noticed the error of our ways in the 1800s, when people who were representing the Confederacy in the Senate were then reelected to the U.S. Senate. Okay? The fact that we didn't catch it then was a huge problem. And the fact that we still haven't caught it now, equality cannot be achieved until it's wanted. And right now it's just not wanted.
Well, I feel like that isn't correct. I feel like now equality is very much wanted by the people, and everyone's pushing the government, pushing the people in power to get to that equality, to get to where we should have been this whole time. It's about fairness. It's about equality. The United States is, I think, probably the most diverse country in the world, with so many people from so many different races, and this, like, you see each other. Yes, people are from a different race, but we're all humans. We're all the same, and we all should be treated the same. We should all get the same, get all the same opportunities. I'm not calling for communism. That is not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that by the letter of the law, we're all the same. So because we've been breaking that law for centuries, we should fix it. There are ways to fix it. There are ways to make sure that the socioeconomic status of minorities has to be improved. We have to make sure that the justice system and mass incarceration, the justice system is fixed, and mass incarceration is no longer a thing. That can be pushed towards, and we could reach that. But we're not, and it is one of the most. It's incredibly disappointing to see that from all sides. And yes, some sides worse than others, and some sides are just helping a little bit. But if we do small changes and small things, like the bill that we talked about previously, it's additional things added to stop things. It's a great starting point. It's one of those things where just give it a little bit, but not fix the problem. It doesn't fix the problem. It helps out a little bit, but it's not the solution.
It's a good start, and it's a very overdue step, I think, is the main issue. That's what I was. discussing earlier, like I think the fact that politicians are only the people want equality, but the politicians are not wanting equality until they've basically been forced to. I mean, cities are shut down. New York and Minneapolis are major cities in their states, and New York's one of the largest cities in the world. Those cities have been shut down by the coronavirus, but now, as it's starting to reopen by these protests, people are not okay with the status quo anymore, and they haven't been for a while. So the fact that politicians now are finally coming around is a good thing, but I think it's just, at this point, it's almost not too late, but it's
never
overdue.
Too late,
It's overdue.
never too
That's
late.
my main
It's
issue.
overdue.
That it's overdue by
I mean,
far.
it's better late than never, but like, why'd it take this long? It's like,
And it shouldn't have taken this long because we noticed these trends for years, and it's under both sides have noticed it.
Yeah, but the thing is, Bo, is that you have people noticing it. You have people, like, we see this every single day, that this has been an issue, and these are massive protests. The civil rights movement in its final days, well, in its closing days, it took 6 months of riots in America to get those freedoms that we're all looking for. But now we see that it's only been 3 weeks, and this could go on for longer. And if we get, like, to get somewhere, to get to true equality, we might have to go rioting for a year. But this needs to be pushed. This needs to go on forward. And I feel like the cynic in me, like, wants to say that, oh well, like, these protests, like, the government's gonna say, like, okay, we're gonna give you a little bit, like, we're gonna appease the protesters, and then we're gonna keep on doing the same thing. And that is something that I'm, like, slightly scared of by myself. But I hope that we can get big change through on both sides.
it's
And
like, sorry, like, the thing is like, what they can really only do is, like, pass laws or, like, implement training, but, like, nothing is going to change unless, like, the actual, like, personal biases of people, like, if people, like, actually work on that and, like, check themselves. And I mean, there's things like in my local government, there was just a thing where, like, some council person, I don't remember from what exactly, he was like, he literally said maybe African Americans are more affected by the coronavirus because they don't know how to wash themselves as good. Like, how is that even, like, a statement that, like, an educated person who is representing people in government, like, makes? Like, it's, the thing is, they can pass laws. We've already passed laws about this. Like, it's just not going to make a difference unless people actually work on themselves and check their own personal biases.
yeah, I feel like we've had a great conversation about this, like, racial justice and racial inequality in America, and I feel like we should be coming to an end in this podcast. We have talked about a lot. We have mentioned a lot of the things that I think we've talked about everything we want to talk about. This might be a first.
That's a first. That's a first.
Yeah. Yeah. No, but the thing is, this is, like, as you can see, we're very passionate about this, like, this idea of equality, and this pushing things through, and it is unfortunate. It is very unfortunate to see, like, the response and how lackluster it's been for centuries. But, well, we as a young generation can only be hopeful and do what we can do for to change the people in power. But that is that is by the side. So we hope that everyone listening here supports the movement, supports the Black Lives Matter movement, supports the protesters, not the rioters, the protesters. And we hope that we've actually taught you something, maybe opened your eyes to something that you didn't see before. And I hope you enjoyed this episode of Politics.